Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. As ever, I'm joined by three experts here in the studio, and today we have Garrett O'Hanlon, who is the founding director of MAP Surveyors. Hello.
Hello, good morning.
And Simon Zutshi, author of international bestseller Property Magic and founder of Property Investors Network. Hi, hello. Simon. Hi. And finally, Paul Mahoney, managing director of Nova Financial Group.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? So we've got loads to get through today, gentlemen. If I may start with Garrett. Our first question is, we are looking to get a drain survey for a pre-purchase Victorian terrace. Issues with damp and wet soil under the floorboards in the ground floor. Any advice on how to look?
Carefully, I would suggest. Obviously, we sometimes get part of the picture, not necessarily all of the picture. It sounds as if they've had a survey done and that's recommended some further investigation with the possibility of defective drains. Certainly, a closed-circuit television camera survey of the drains would be prudent, and that would indicate to you if there are deficiencies, and by sending the camera down the line where those deficiencies are. I'd be concerned by the suggestion that there is just soil under the floorboards rather than
no foundations.
Well, foundations to the walls, but no concrete oversight to the floor. Which brings issues, and I'd be very concerned if there is the suggestion of defective drains and damp soil, because the soil will be damp potentially with more than just water. So
nice.
You would have thought that might be evident from within the house, but you would need to get that soil tested because there's a risk of contamination, serious contamination there. So yeah, certainly get the drains tested. It does sound as if you need to maybe strip out the whole of the floor and replace with a concrete oversight as well. So you're talking about a very big job here. And certainly, yes, before you commit to any further purchase, you need that.
Right. And in terms of the kind of person that they should get in to do this work, would you bring in a surveyor, or would you bring in a drain specialist, or both?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds as if they've had the surveyor in already. So, yes, you need a company that specialises in closed-circuit television camera surveys of drains. There is a professional body for those. I can't recall the name of it offhand, but certainly we've got details of that, and I'm sure lots of other surveyors would have too. So make sure they're professionally qualified, make sure they will offer insurance-backed guarantees for any work which they undertake, and make sure that you've got to be careful too, because this could be a shared run, potentially, if it's in a Victorian house. So you've got to be cautious about who's further up and down that line, what their contribution to that might need to be, and the fact that if you do need to repair these, you mustn't interrupt the service to
someone else's home.
You know, and this is increasingly becoming an issue with Victorian houses. They often have shared water supplies too, and the same applies. You can't just cut your water supply off to do what you want to do, because other people rely on it, and God knows they could be on dialysis or anything in their home. So just proceed with extreme caution and be aware there could be a joint liability there.
And with the idea of the wet soil, I mean, are we talking that actually those sewage pipes could literally have just cracked and everything is coming out? Could it be as big an issue as that, do you think, Sam?
It certainly could. I've seen issues like that. I won't go into too much detail on the programme in case people are eating or something, but we've seen lots of things over the years, and escapes of effluent do occur, and sometimes vigorously and undiscovered for a long period of time, and the health implications are very, very serious. And your liabilities in law could extend to other parties if that contamination due to negligence on your part has affected somebody else.
Yeah.
So a very, very serious issue, certainly.
So it doesn't sound like a simple thing that would be solved. It sounds like quite a big job.
It certainly could be.
So there would be financial implications with that.
Absolutely, and again, you need to know that clearly before you commit to that purchase.
She's saying it's wet soil under the floorboards. She's not actually talking about floorboards in the house. So.
Well, I'm assuming we're talking about a floor void there. So you have the floorboards and then a void, and then you would normally expect to see a concrete oversight, brick sleeper walls and a timber wall plate separated by a damp-proof membrane. It could be very bad. It could be the floorboards are directly onto the soil, which is a nightmare scenario, and it could give you dry rot as well.
Right.
It could be that there are sleeper walls and so forth, but there is no concrete oversight. So, like I say, with a lot of these things, you need to dig a little bit deeper, no pun intended, before you find out exactly what's going on there.
Definitely not to be ignored.
It doesn't sound like a simple and easy problem.
Okay. Thank you. That's brilliant. If I could move on to Simon. Our next question is from someone who has a 3-bedroom house. They live on their own and have 2 spare bedrooms. They were going to rent them both out to 2 separate people whilst they still live in the house in the first room. Now, the government website says, your home is a house in multiple occupation, HMO, if both of the following apply. At least 3 tenants live there, forming more than 1 household. You share a toilet, bathroom or kitchen facilities with other tenants. She's asking, or he's asking, I do apologise, do I count as a tenant if it's my home? There will be 2 tenants and me, the homeowner. Also, I have a mortgage. Would I need to tell my bank lender? It's a regular mortgage, not a buy-to-let.
Okay, so it's a very common situation, but a complicated answer, I'm afraid. So technically, 3 or more unrelated people in a house does constitute an HMO. However, the owner is obviously not a tenant, and the 2 tenants aren't normal tenants you'd have under an AST contract. They'd be under kind of a license. So if they didn't pay the rent, you could basically get them out. And even if you have friends living in the house, it is important to make sure you do have a contract in place, because sometimes when things go wrong, friendships don't really work. So it's very important to have contracts. So it is an HMO, and let's just think about the implications of that. So first of all, it probably won't need an HMO licence. The government guideline is for 5 or more people living in a house needs a licence. However, some councils have introduced additional licensing, and they would say that 3 or more people living in a house would need a licence. So the first thing to do is check with the owner's local council to see how many people in their particular area require a licence for the HMO. That's the first thing. Whether it needs a licence or not, it should have the safety requirements that an HMO would have. So first of all, really they should have an interlinked smoke alarm system, so that if a fire started in one of the bedrooms, everyone would be alerted so we can get out quickly. You know, safety of the people living in the house should be one of the primary concerns of this property owner. So that would need to be done. I believe unless it's a 3-storey building, it may not need fire doors, but if it's 3 stories, it would need fire doors. Again, speaking to the local HMO licensing department, they're really helpful, and they're there to help and give advice and guidance, and they'd be able to advise what the situation should be. You might think, well, this sounds like a lot of work and effort, but what you need to remember is the government have actually, for many, many years, had a scheme called Rent-a-Room Scheme, where you can rent a room out in your home, or a couple of rooms out, and get a rental income coming in. I think it's something like £7,500 tax-free. So although there might be some initial setup cost, you're going to get that money back very, very quickly. And that would obviously massively help cover the bills and the mortgage. And actually it's how I started. I bought a house and rented out 2 rooms, did exactly the same thing. That was a long time ago, and they weren't really worried about licensing and things in those days, so it was a bit different. The other really important thing is insurance. So if this person has a residential mortgage based on them living in the property, I think it would be a good idea to speak to the mortgage company to say, look, I'm thinking about renting out a couple of rooms, is that okay? Some lenders might be fine, some lenders might say, no, not interested. And actually, a lot of people don't bother to tell their mortgage companies because they feel, well, as long as the mortgage is being paid, what do they really care? And that's up to the individual. What I would say, though, is the insurance is critical. If you are renting out rooms in a property, whoever you have your insurance with, you should have specialist buy-to-let landlord insurance, so that if someone has an accident in the property, for example, you're covered in case they try and sue you. If there are damages, and if you didn't have the appropriate insurance, if you had your insurance with, say, your mortgage company, and they didn't know you're renting out rooms and something happens, they would potentially probably turn around and say, sorry, you're not covered because you didn't tell us you were doing this. So I think it's important to not have insurance with a mortgage company, to have it with a specialist buy-to-let insurance company who know that you're living there, and they know you rent, and you just declare everything to them, be completely upfront and legitimate, and then you should be able to get the appropriate insurance cover. So to summarise, think about the number of people and speak to local council about additional licensing, which you probably wouldn't need to have. Also consider the safety requirements in the property, consider the insurance, and advisedly really speak to your mortgage company as well.
Well done. That was about 4 answers in one.
I said it was a complex answer to a very common question.
Just a note there on the mortgage side of things. If it is 2 people that they don't know, and they're going to put locks on their doors, they should
Yes.
be aware of that, because some surveyors and lenders don't like that. So if they haven't told their lender and then they get a survey done and they see locks on the doors with different people living in those rooms, that would be a dead giveaway.
Yes.
And that could cause them problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
Surveyors don't like locks.
No.
Quote of the day.
I guess it depends who you're having. So
That's right.
when I had friends and we didn't have locks on the doors and it wasn't a problem, and but it's a very good point to make. Especially if you own it and you want to remortgage it, those things might become apparent if a surveyor
And
came
it's going to be
around.
really obvious, as you
Yes,
say.
exactly.
Brilliant.
Actually, one more
Thank
quick
you.
point, because on the surveyor thing, we are required to fill in suspicious activity
Oh,
forms
really?
as well for lenders. So actually, something like that could
Flag it
prevent
up
the mortgage
immediately.
completely.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Oh, everybody's included. I love it. I love it. Paul, I've got a specific question for you now, though. So, hi. I recently bought a second home for my wife and kids to live in, as we were going to be splitting up. As ever with relationships, complications, etc., we have now decided not to. This is good news, I think. We've decided not to, and so we have this other house. I bought the house a month ago for £60,000, so it was exempt from stamp duty, but I'm now considering letting it out. My question is, will I have to retrospectively pay the 3% stamp duty, as it is now a buy-to-let property? And technically it wasn't when I bought it.
It's an interesting question. It sounds as though they already own that second property. They've bought it for $60,000. However, my understanding is that the 3% should have always been levied.
Yes, that's why
because
I
it's
frowned slightly.
the stamp duty premium isn't with relation to whether it's a buy-to-let or not. It's in relation to whether they already own a property, and it seems that this person already does. So it's a bit strange that their solicitor didn't advise them initially. Well, didn't advise them initially they had to pay it, but it's also a bit strange they got away with it. The only way I can see that perhaps they may have got away with it is by saying they were going to move into that property. But again, my understanding is that you claim it back as opposed to having to pay it later on.
Right.
Regardless, in answer to the question, it seems as though they will have to pay it. But I'm surprised they've got away with it in the first place.
So it's
The
almost
only thing
as though
I
they're
can
just
think of
catching up.
is maybe if the partners weren't married and if the first house was in the wife's
Well,
name.
it does say my wife.
Oh, okay, maybe.
Yeah,
'Cause
second
then
home
if,
for my
if
wife
they're not
and
married
kids to live
and
in.
you have them in separate names, and if it's technically their first house
Yeah.
or their only house, then you wouldn't
Then
pay
you
stamp
wouldn't
duty.
pay
But
stamp
I agree with
duty.
Paul. If they're
Yeah.
married, they probably should have had to pay it. in
And
the
if
first
they're
place.
married, they're considered one entity in the eyes of HMRC for stamp duty purposes. So, yeah, it's surprising. It seems like it would be due. I'm just surprised they've got away with it in the first place.
Maybe they did their own conveyancing, so there was nobody
Maybe.
there to actually
Yeah,
advise them.
sometimes
properly.
Perhaps
do
we
do
shouldn't
that.
dig any deeper.
Yes.
And actually, on that point, I think sometimes people do their own conveyancing, they try and do their own mortgage just to try and save costs. I think that's a really bad idea. I think you should always just pay for a professional, because they should be guiding you and advising you. And by the way, if they make a mistake, they will have professional indemnity insurance. You can go
yes.
back and claim on them,
Indeed.
rather than you making a mistake and you're the only person who's responsible.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen. Well, that's all we've got time for in this first half of the show. Please come back after the break and we'll have lots more questions and lots more advice for you. Welcome back to Property Question Time with me, Shona Lindsay, and my lovely guests today. We have Garrett O'Hanlon, Simon Zutshi, and Paul Mahoney. So let's crack on with this next lot of questions, gentlemen, if we may. Garrett, I'll go back with you. What difference are there, if any, between using a surveyor or a structural engineer for a building survey on a property?
Okay, it's really about picking the right person for the job, as always. Don't go to your proctologist for dentistry, it's a poor route, and you should really choose the right person in the first place. So, structural engineers are fantastically qualified professionals, but the manner of their qualification doesn't really equip them specifically to undertake residential surveys. There are some people within the structural engineering industry who've chosen to go down that route, and some of those are very good. But if you take, for instance, the situation where you might have a problem with a property that, and we had some recently where there was a non-compliance issue with elements of the property with lenders' requirements. Now, we value properties for lenders too, so we understand all of those requirements. Now, engineers are very unlikely to be involved on lenders' panels, so they wouldn't perhaps be able to give you that element of advice that there is a conflict, a problem with that could cause you a problem later on. So they're ideal, for example, if you're calculating a through lounge beam or a chimney breast support or something like that. But really and truly, if you want a survey on a property, you do need a surveyor. You need somebody who is experienced, who specialises in residential surveys. Increasingly, it is a feature because, as I've said on the programme before, lenders, to a much greater extent now, won't send anybody at all to look at the property. The valuation will be done from a desktop on an automated valuation model. So that's an imperative you get somebody to look at it for you. And whilst some structural engineers could be okay, generally you should stick with a surveyor.
And what are these sort of issues that come up that would make it very different in terms of what the mortgage company wants? And when we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the potential HMO, about the locks on doors, is it that kind of thing? Or
It's often the manner of the construction. Certain types of concrete construction is well documented as not being acceptable. But the fact is lenders' policies change, and we had one very recently where it was a particular type of timber construction, let's say, which sits outside regular timber frame but has always been acceptable broadly to lenders. But in fairly recent times, the lender's policy has changed, and so it's less acceptable now. And if you're not involved in that arena, if you don't have those 100 manuals, which we do in our office, to tell you what the lenders are requiring at different times, then they won't understand that. And there was another issue with that too, about sprayed foam under the slates and things. So, as I say, engineers have their place, and some are very good, but I think you really must stick to a surveyor to do a residential survey.
Specifics.
Yeah.
Thank you. Brilliant. Simon. So, a very quick question, completely different to your first one. My 18-year-old son has £15,000 to invest. Is this enough for him to get on the property ladder?
Okay, so I guess it kind of depends where in the country he lives.
Yes.
You know, if he's putting a deposit in to buy a property, if a property is a sub 100,000, that would definitely be enough money for them to get a first property under the on the property ladder. If they were in London and it's buying a £400,000 property, probably not. So when an 18-year-old would be a first-time buyer, and so they'll be able to get a 90 or 95% mortgage. The more they can put in as a deposit, the better, because they'll have a lower interest rate. Otherwise, it might be a bit too expensive. But the other thing is the mortgage. And so depending on what the 18-year-old does, if they don't have an income, a very high income, they may struggle to get a mortgage. Now, the parents, if they have a good income, they can act as guarantors and come on the mortgage as well, and give the mortgage company reassurance that, yes, in the event of the 18-year-old not being able to pay, they'll be able to step in and cover the mortgage. A particular strategy that does work very well is if this 18-year-old was, for example, going to university, and they were going to be there for a number of years. They'd have lots of friends. They could potentially rent out the rooms in their house to their friends, subject to HMO licensing, as we talked about before. And actually, that would be a good scenario because, again, the rental income would more than cover the mortgage. They'll be able to use their personal tax allowance, and because they wouldn't be working because they're a student, and also their rental room scheme. So they get about up to £19,000 rent, tax-free rent coming in,
which would be a great start for
which
someone.
would really help cover the costs and
Yeah.
even pay for their tuition fees maybe. So there's also an argument to say that if they were going to university and the parents wanted to top up that £15,000 to help put the deposit in and be guarantors on the mortgage, that's probably far more cost effective for them, getting a bigger house that can be rented out rather than having to pay tuition fees and accommodation, etc. whilst at university. And by putting it in the 18-year-old's name, they get the benefits of being a first house, not having stamp duty, being able to get the income, and all the various allowances and things. Whereas what most parents do, they put it in their name and they have to pay tax on all the income, they have to pay stamp duty, they pay capital gains when it's sold. So it's just thinking a slightly different way. But the biggest thing would be the ability to be a guarantor on the mortgage to improve and help with the affordability.
Yeah, and to be, as you say, potentially get a bigger place and then be bringing income in from that as well.
Yes. Yeah.
What about crowdfunding as well? That
I
might
was
be
just
an
about
option.
to ask that, yeah.
Well, there are some equity crowdfunding sites where if you give up some of the equity, they can come and put the money in. But whether they would do that for I think crowdfunding and peer-to-peer is a massive growing market, and who knows, that might be the way we fund all properties in the future, if people don't want to work with banks anymore, which is a possibility. But at the moment, I think that there's a good route of doing it, which is as long as the parents have got some substance.
And it's going to be theirs.
Exactly, yeah. The problem with Help to Buy and also with crowdfunding, if you're giving away some of the equity to someone else, you're not really going to benefit from the true growth of the property. And if you've got 15,000 to start with, that's a good deposit in some areas of the country.
It's that bank and mum and dad thing, which is becoming an increasing feature, isn't it? And mentioned more and more.
But it's a different way to look at it, actually. It's the bank and mum and dad actually growing and actually feeling like it's getting something back as well.
And if you think about it, if ultimately the parents want to have a legacy and leave some inheritance to their kids, giving them some money and getting onto the ladder earlier than they would normally if they're doing it on their own is actually quite a smart thing. Because then they gain the growth from another property as well by maybe releasing some equity from their own home or an investment property, whatever it might be. And I think that's really realistically how most people get on the ladder these days. It does seem very hard for people to save enough money to be able to get a deposit. And an 18-year-old saving he might have had inheritance maybe, but saving £15,000 is to be commended.
Yeah,
Not
and
many
good on him
18-year-olds.
that he wants to do something positive with it,
And if they don't have that available, although you say you're giving away with equity with the Help to Buy, 15,000 with Help to Buy does allow you to buy a £300,000 property. So, so long as he has the affordability and has some income to support a 55% loan on 300 grand, he would be able to buy a £300,000 property in London with a 40% equity loan.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? And you've come into the conversation just as I want to ask you a question, Paul. So this one's directly for you. I am in the process of remortgaging a property and changing from a personal mortgage to a buy-to-let. Also in this process, I'm looking to add my partner onto this mortgage. Will there be stamp duty owed on my partner's half of the property if we do this?
Okay, so good question. That will greatly depend on whether they're married.
Right.
If they are married, I believe that you can get a stamp duty concession.
Right. A concession, not a full exemption.
I know for a fact that you wouldn't pay. You wouldn't pay capital gains, but I believe that you can get a concession if you are married. If you're not, there would be stamp duty. It would also depend on whether the lender needs the partner to become an owner, because essentially, if the partner was to become an owner, then obviously there's a change of ownership, and that's both a capital gains tax and a stamp duty event. If they didn't need to become an owner, again, perhaps if they're married, the lender may consider them as one entity, and they may both be able to be on the mortgage without having to change the ownership of the property.
So you're not actually changing the deeds per se, you're just changing what it says on the mortgage.
Yeah,
right.
so I think the answer to that question would very much depend on whether they're married or not,
right.
both on the stamp duty piece and the mortgage side of things, as to whether the partner needed to become an owner of the property.
And obviously we don't have that information, but hopefully that was useful to who was asking the question at home.
Yeah, it would make sense to get both tax advice and conveyancing advice on that point.
Thank you, thank you. Well, that's all we've got time for today for this edition of Property Question Time. But don't forget, if you have any questions for our experts, please write to us either through the website, which is www.property-tv.co.uk, or directly on an email at info@propertytelevision.tv. Before I go, a huge thanks to my lovely guests here in the studio, to Garrett O'Hanlon, to Simon Zutshi and Paul Mahoney. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you on the next edition of Property Question Time. Bye.